Hello everyone, I'm Stephen Carlton. I'm the Director of the Centre for Critical and Creative Writing here at the University of Queensland. I am going to be your host this evening for this inaugural UQ Book Club event. We're very excited, and judging by the number of you who are registered so far and are popping up in real time on our attendance list so far, I think we're onto a bit of a goer here, and that there will be more than this inaugural event. I've got a little bit of housekeeping before I introduce our writer this evening, but before we get onto that, whilst it's great to see so many of you gathering there in cyberspace, I would like to acknowledge the Jagera and the Turrbal as the traditional custodians of the beautiful grounds that the university is actually situated upon, and to pay respect to elders past, present and emerging. Welcome to all of you who've joined us this evening. An online book club. The first book that we're sharing together is Miranda Rieu's extraordinary new novel, Stone Sky Gold Mountain, which you've all read. It is quite virtually, not quite literally, hot off the press. I was just chatting with Miranda about this, and Miranda tells me it was the first Australian book to be launched by Zoom while we're here in lockdown. So we're very lucky to be amongst its first readers. And the University of Queensland Press have told me that, that the book has shot to the top of their best-selling list this week, or maybe even this month. And I think maybe the book club has helped generate some of those sales, which is just terrific. Before I introduce you to Miranda, I just wanted to give you a sense of how we will proceed tonight. We've only got an hour, and we'll spend roughly half of that time with me and Miranda chatting about the book and about the process involved in researching and writing the novel. And then we'll hand over to you for some curated questions, which our behind-the-scenes assistants, Emily and Mary, are going to help field for us. If you could type your questions into the Q&A section of the Zoom menu at the bottom of your screens, we'll collate them and we'll pass them through in half an hour or so. And then we're going to end the session by voting in real time for the book that we choose to read next month. Again, kindly provided and supplied to us by our friends at the University of Queensland Press. So let's meet Miranda. Miranda, hello.
Hello, Stephen. How are you?
I'm very well. So lovely to have you here. A little bit about Miranda. She has had her work shortlisted for the Stella Prize and the Queensland Literary Awards UQ Fiction Prize. Her work has appeared in Best Australian Stories, Meanjin, Review of Australian Fiction, Griffith Review and Best Summer Stories. Miranda has a PhD in creative writing from across town at the QUT and literary studies, and she lives here in Brisbane. Miranda, so great to have you here. Wondering if you could kick things off by reading us.
Oh, sure. Okay.
So, from the novel, let's just jump straight in and hear.
Okay. First, I'd like to also acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land I live on, which are the Jagera and Turrbal people, but also the Western Yalanji people up north, whose land I have written this book on, the Maytown sort of Palmer River area. So this is from the beginning of the book, and it's about Ying and Lai Yue, the brother and sister, are together, and he's about to help her shave her hair to look more like a boy. So it's just a small section. Lowering herself onto the stool in front of her brother, Ying lifts the straw hat from her head. She holds her plait in her right hand and leans her head back towards him. The metal of the razor scrapes across her scalp, as warm as blood. When Lai Yue's finished, Ying runs her hand over the bald front half of her head. Her fingertips search out the line that divides the skin of her scalp from where her queue begins. She turns to glare at Lai Yue. You always take too much off. It looks ugly. She unravels the plait so she can free the shaved hair that hangs loose from her scalp. Her brother shrugs. I have to make it straight. Sometimes I shave too closely in one place and then I have to straighten up the rest. And anyway, you're supposed to look like an ugly boy. You're not a pretty girl here, Ying. She breathes in, feeling the band tight about her chest. Her breasts are no bigger than shrimp dumplings, but still she has to hide them. She's seen the look in the eyes of some of the men when they catch sight of the white women in town. She doesn't want to see that look directed at her. Not here, not where lust will be mixed with fury at her trickery. A grin lifts Laya's lips. Not that you're ever a pretty girl, Ying, even in China. His words sting, yet she's pleased to see that smile. She can't remember the last time he looked happy. He's only 19 years old, but there are creases in his forehead that weren't there before they came to this place. And the skin under his eyes is pale, baggy. The bruise on his cheek has faded a little, is no longer the livid purple of an eggplant, and the cut above his lip has nearly healed and looks like nothing more than one of the many other wrinkles or creases scored into his skin by this land's cruel sun. They weren't quick enough the last time a rowdy bunch of white fellows descended upon them, didn't hear the drunken cries of roll up, in time to save their 2 pickaxes, the sturdy metal pan they'd traded Ying's winter coat for, and the last of the rice they'd hidden deep in the soil. One man, as gingery as a fox with thick, shaggy eyebrows, swung the spade against Laya's head and called out something in his devil tongue before chasing after the others. Their camp, nearly 60 Chinese men, had scattered in all directions like a swarm of locusts shaken violently from a tree. Ying is learning their white language swiftly, but not quickly enough to catch words shouted in anger, in threats.
Fabulous, thank you. So many threads that I wanted to pick up on there, and that I'm sure our readers at home did as well. But just to kick off with an entry point sort of question for
Yep.
Mirandi, what was the germ? I shouldn't be talking about germs, I suppose, but what was the germ that kind of got in your system and compelled you to tell this story and attracted you to this region of Queensland and this time in our history?
Well, I guess originally, so I'm Eurasian. My father's Chinese Indonesian, so he's Chinese, but he was born in Indonesia. So I've always been, it's always been a space I felt I wanted to write in. And my original fiction, which is crime fiction set in Victorian London, features Eurasian characters. So for that, and that was part of my PhD, is that I was researched the Asian population of Victorian London. I was looking at that concept of the sinister Oriental. So I'd done the research into that and written these characters, but I actually wanted to write something closer to home. I wanted to write an Australian novel, and about the first Chinese here, I guess, like I was writing about in London. But so originally, of course, you're looking at the gold rush. Probably originally I was looking at the Chinese in the Victorian gold rush. So I did a bit of research down there because they have great museums and, Bendigo and Ballarat and that. But slowly but surely I worked my way up the coast because the Victorian goldfields is sort of well known. It's been done. Probably not too much in fiction. I don't think there's been a lot of fiction about the Chinese in the gold rush. I've lived in Cairns. My partner's from North Queensland. So I sort of worked my way up in my research, my way up the coast, and eventually hit Cooktown at the top where, Maytown's near Cooktown. And there's a lot of information there. And then, of course, I read about, how many more, there were just so many more Chinese diggers there than, say, white Australian diggers. So it just took off from there. But it sort of germinated for 2 or 3 years, I guess, that from that initial idea that I wanted to explore the first Chinese here. And originally I did want it to be, I guess, a Eurasian, almost a love story. I wanted to look at maybe a white Australian girl forming a relationship with a Chinese boy. Just because I've always been interested as a Eurasian in those Eurasian relationships from, the 1800s that either worked or didn't work. And if they did work, how did they, how did their relationships survive, white Australia? So it all sort of started from there. And then once I did the research on North Queensland, it inevitably became a bit different to what I originally thought.
The book seems really well informed by what must be field research. I get the sense, you kind of answered the question in the acknowledgements at the end of the book, but so Maytown is a ghost town today, right? There's just,
Yes.
there's
Yes.
virtually nothing left there. Did you go?
I did, yes. It was very interesting.
What was the
Cooktown
space like?
itself, sorry?
What was it like?
Yeah, so Cooktown itself is really interesting because it has the museums. It has all the information and photos and relics of what was there. And then it took maybe 2-3 hours in four-wheel driving to get to Maytown itself through, along the Palmer River. I think there at the moment, there was one man who has a station there, and then a bit further on, there's another family in Palmersville or somewhere. But that's it. Like when we were there, we actually got bogged in the sand, and we thought we'd be there forever because there was just no one around, So when you get to Maytown itself, it's just like forest. So you can see where the dirt road was, and down the side you can see the remnants of where they tried to where they curbed it, with stone.
Yeah.
There's still the stumps from, I think it was the post office, and since that's all that's left. Oh, and there's some sort of bricks left from where the oven was for the bakery.
Yeah.
But apart from that, all that's there now is that one of the historical societies has now put in plaques along that dirt track where the shops used to be. So it'll be something like Chinese name, the pharmacy, the bakery, and other Chinese names, down each side of the road, which is really interesting. But that's all that's left of them, of these plaques. And I mean, it was a bustling town for a long, maybe I think 10 to 15 years, in that it had the post office. I think it had a bank, it had schooling, it had, like I always say, it had a lemonade factory, which I think is just.
I love that detail. I do love that.
I had to use it at a lemonade
several
factory.
pubs. You used the word bustling. I found that as well. That it was this sense. It reminded me of your depiction of Maytown. Reminded me a little bit of Deadwood. This brutal kind of front.
Yeah.
Violence is always menacing and threatening to erupt. There's no real policing, no real justice, especially if you're.
Yeah, and I think, I mean, they did have like I've written about, they had the warden, and they had police, they had the troopers, but sort of going between there and law, and that they weren't sort of stationed there necessarily. But I've only watched one Deadwood, and I think my Maytown is probably not as unruly as Deadwood. I think it's definitely more Chinese, because in the area there were 20,000 Chinese compared to say 5,000 white.
Yeah.
So there definitely more Chinese than in Deadwood. On Foxtel, there's a new series, I think it came out last year, called Warriors, or Warriors, and it's about the Chinese Tongs and people, gold diggers, who went to San Francisco in the same period. Which was of great interest to me, except it's different from mine as well, because it's full of kung fu. Like, it's one of those sort of martial arts series, and it's really, really good. So I think it's probably, my Maytown's probably not as brutal as it could be. I have read a lot of those gold rush towns, or you could hear at night time, say, were gunshots of women screaming. So, I mean, I can only guess what but my Maytown had, families. So I think it was probably had a bit more sort of order.
Yeah, that's great. We'll go to the audience questions in about 15 minutes, but some of them that have come through are picking up on the conversation that we're having. My next question was going to be about the research, which you've already begun to talk about. And a question from Catherine, just saying that the trek across country, that Palmer River and into the kind of Gulf country, it reminded her of the journey in Voss by Patrick White. Was that inspiration?
Thank you. um, I actually, so a lot of that information I got for the tracking light for Layer was taken from Mulligan, was one of the first white sort of surveyors of the area to looking for gold. So he's written, you know, his accounts of it. Then there was that Warden Hill, who I sort of based that Warden on at the beginning. So I've taken, you know, and they talk about the terrible heat and that how they get terrible, you know, even dysentery and, you know, so I sort of based a lot of what I read there, and I've lived in North Queensland, so I know all about the heat and the mold and the insects, and I, you know, spent time there. But also there was a book, a sort of memoir written by a fellow called Tamzi Wu, and he wrote about coming from China to dig for gold, I think with his father and brother. And he's the one who talks about how terrible that trip was, you know, how it took so long. And I think they got halfway through and ran out of supplies, and one of them had to track back all the way to Cooktown to get supplies again. And they're the one, it was in his account that I read, that their shoulders would be bleeding, you know, every night they'd have to like peel everything off their bleeding shoulders from, you know, carrying all their stuff. So so I got that information from quite a few sources, and how I felt walking around the area.
I enjoyed all that detail, and I enjoyed that sense of like of the olfactory, like tastes and smells. The book felt very alive in that sense, you know, just that like the observation, that what it must be like from the outside coming in, you know, if you're a stranger.
I really wanted to pick up on that. I wanted to pick up on what it must have been like to first see here.
Yeah.
And I think sorry.
Oh, sorry to interrupt you. The image there that I really loved was that the eucalypt smelled like bay leaves. I went, oh, of course it does, doesn't it?
Yeah. Well, you know, the whole area. So I guess as the writer, I had to consider how all of that would have looked to me for the first time. If I, you know, obviously I grew up here, so it's not my first time, but you have to like imagine what it might have been like. And I think some of that part of southern China has the same sort of heat, and but I wanted, especially through Lai Ye, he is obviously finds the landscape and Australia confronting, whereas Ying sees its beauty. So they see it in different ways. But yeah, it was very important that it was all new to them.
A question from Kelly has nicely anticipated an observation I had as well. The bird life is so active throughout. I kept on, chapter after chapter, there's birds, different birds. Could you talk a little bit about that? What
about the birds?
Yeah, are you a bird?
And all the insects.
Are you a twitcher?
I think what it is when you, well, partly I love birds, but when you go there, I guess people must notice this when they even go bush now from the city, just how many more birds you actually see. And you know, there were some birds that I saw there that I didn't even fit into the book because I couldn't have too many blackbirds. But we saw black cockatoos up there, and I mean, I would have loved to. Actually, originally I wanted the blackbird to be a black cockatoo. I just had a harder time describing how Lai Ye would describe it himself, you know, like this black parrot. So I stuck with the crow or the blackbird. But I guess when you're up there, you just do see all these beautiful birds and insects that you just don't see, you know, in our suburbs. So I probably just noticed it. And of course, I think that's one of the joys of being a writer too, actually, is that it does make you more observant because you're, you know, in your mind, you are taking notes for your work.
Yeah. Do you feel that? Do you start kind of channeling the characters? Do you think, do you switch, do you kind of occupy each character and then kind of shift from one to the other, or do you sit within, you know, the central, who did you sit inside the most while you were writing?
Well, I think what happens is, like, say the nature stuff, I would just take the notes generally. And then, you know, they would fit in where they came. The characters, so there might be something I see that's positive or a comment or something, and I might assign it to a character. This is in the original note-taking kind of time. I had a 2-month residency in Shanghai, and mostly when I was there, so I wrote every morning and then I'd go explore in the afternoon, but most morning, so there for the whole time I worked on Lai Ye's part, because I thought because his is a bit separate from the girls, I wanted his tension, the tension to kind of keep on building, and the trajectory of the story to sort of be connected. So I worked the whole time just on his part of the story. So I guess for that period I was in his head. With the girls, I probably did more head hopping, like I did, I probably did Ying, and then I went to, what's Miriam up to, back to Ying, what's Miriam up to, and then because I had to meld them eventually when they were going to meet, and their stories were going to delve into each other's. But I do find writing, and even the style you write in, comes from a bit of role playing, like you were saying, and especially like say with my crime fiction, that character is very different. She's a bit flippity, and so I think, and I just can't even help how I write her. So I think there is a bit of role playing, like you were saying, as part of it. Yeah, not that I get into costume or anything, but
internally.
But I would.
There is a related question there that spins off that from Kyla. I'm interested in the internal psychology going on as well, in particular Lai Ye's extreme mental distress. So what, Miranda, did you draw on to write those scenes, particularly at the end of the novel? And also, what was the impact on you in immersing yourself in such extreme mental distress to have to write about?
Okay, so I'd say with Lai Ye, there were 3 parts to him. Besides maybe there's 4 sides to him. So I wanted to tap into that he was the eldest son, and the whole not coping with not being able to do traditionally what he needs to do for the family as the eldest son, through circumstance, and that he's been left this terrible, the loss of their farm and everything from the father, and that maybe he doesn't have the moral strength, I guess, that Ying has just originally. With his whole trajectory, and I think we did discuss we were going to do spoilers tonight.
Yeah, we're going to assume that our knowledgeable participants.
Okay. So originally, he was going to be. The story was going to be from Ying and Miriam's point of view, and his story was just through Ying. Like Ying was going to know what he was up to. Lai Ye didn't have a part, but slowly, the more I worked on my notes and everything, he sort of became a stronger character. So I was reading Eric Rolls has this great book called Sojourners, and it's where he's compiled all the sort of information on the Chinese during the gold rush or during that whole late 1800s, from newspaper sources and that sort of thing. Anyway, he has this one really sad line about a Chinese fellow in probably about 1850s, 1860s he's a shepherd on some sort of farm in Victoria, and all the line is something like, and blah, 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 hanged himself, that's, because he was all alone. And it was just such a sad line about this poor fellow who was probably, alone, couldn't get back home, felt no hope, and I guess that one line fed my, it just totally gave me Lai Ye's journey straight, just there.
Yeah.
So what happened is, and then I was reading a few years ago, and so it was only about 3 years ago, they had an article in the New Yorker about a fraud that was going on in New York in the Chinese community of like this woman had been conned out of her jewelry and money because another woman had told her that somebody who knew spirits said that her son, a ghost bride wanted her son, so you know, which meant he would die to be with the ghost bride, unless she gave this spiritualist person this money and jewelry to.
Oldest trick in the book.
Pardon? Yeah.
Oldest trick in the book.
Well, in the Chinese book, it is. Obviously, it's still going on because they really do believe in ghost brides and husbands. And even on Netflix at the moment, there's I think it's a Malaysian Chinese series, and it's quite good, set around 1800s, called Ghost Bride, I think, about this girl who's married into a family to marry their dead son. So it is something that is in Chinese culture. So, and it's obviously something that still happens. So that's what gave me the idea for Ghost Bride. Now, and then of course there's his sort of mental illness. And I also was reading, so I read this book by a woman, an American woman, I've forgotten the name of it, but it's just really brilliant. And it's about her, her life with schizophrenia. Mm-hmm. So I guess that informed some of Laya's behaviour. But like I've said before, I can't be sure myself even if Shan is really a ghost or his, subconscious or whatever. Mm-hmm. So that's all in the mix.
That's nice to know. It doesn't. The book never collapses itself into the Gothic there, does it? Okay, let's move on to questions then from our Zoom webinar participants. They're coming through thick and fast. Question Rose, I was interested in the details of how Ying coped with urinating as a man, which she would have had to do in that rough outdoor setting, and handling her menstruation, matters often ignored in novels where girls pass themselves off as men. Was that based on research?
Yeah, I just knew, I thought, so originally I wrote Ying as a girl because, like I said, originally it was going to be a boy. And I think what happened is because I wanted to write about a Chinese woman. So, and obviously the only way she could be on the dig with her brother was dressed up as a man, because I think even in Australia at the time there were only 2 or 3 Chinese women in Australia, and they wouldn't have been, on a dig with their brother. So I had her, that's why I had her dress up as a boy. And I did research women who historically have lived, as men, and a lot of the time it's in the military. So, for whatever reason, they've been getting away with it for a long, that those individuals got away with it for a long time. So, so I guess I had to be a bit creative with the period thing. I did Google, obviously. And the other one was, so as you know, in the book I have him, he's made her a sheath sort of thing that she can use to wee. But I did Google it, and then I noticed, when you Google things and then you go on Facebook and it has that sort of directed advertising, I got hit with all these ads for a Shewee, plastic Shewees. So then I knew what they looked like. So,
great.
So my wooden one is based on a plastic Shewee.
That's good to know. That's great. Good trivia knowledge. Suzanne asks, she says, I like the way you conveyed the sense of smell throughout the novel. How do you think people actually coped with the stinkiness of others in that period?
My mum years ago, my mum's a feminist, and she hated housework, A, and B, she loved dogs. And I remember her saying really scornfully, and she was, a communist. I remember her saying quite scornfully that I think she'd read something too, that it's quite a new thing to be fussy about smell. It's quite a sort of modern thing, this fussiness about smell. And I've always, it's probably true. I mean, until probably even, the 1900s, I mean, people didn't bathe that often, and I think they would have just been used to terrible stench, and breath and everything. Like they must have just been used to it, So I think when she came back from the dig, she was particularly, like Ying was particularly dirty, and probably smelly, but but I think generally much more used to it than we would be.
Imagine Sophie's job then. You know, imagine prostituting in that kind of busy environment. Okay, Catherine asks, why? Oh, you've just answered that. Oh, I'm sorry, I've just answered the next. You've answered that. You've anticipated the next question. Catherine asked why Ying was pretending to be a boy.
Why she was pretending to be a boy? Yes.
Yeah.
There's no way she could have been on the dig as a woman, and she needed to stay with her brother, so she wasn't sort of sold off or whatever as well. And it was really the only way they could go to the gold rush together was if she was pretending to be a boy, which actually makes me wonder if there were more that pretended to be boys.
It added obviously an extra level of tension to the novel, you know, that sense of will she be revealed. I think that was kind of one of the threats that hung over and propelled the narrative. That was one of the things we invest in, you know, that I hope she revealed. But it also obviously adds that extra dimension of kind of same-sex erotics then to the courtship with Miriam, that Miriam is oblivious to.
Yes. Oh, well, so originally I did consider going further with that sort of theme or that branch of the story. But I soon realised that was another book altogether. You know, if going into how their relationship would have developed along those lines is a totally different book to what I was writing. So it just kind of didn't go that way. But originally, I was going to explore that, but it just didn't happen. And in fact, when I think of Miriam, I wonder if maybe, you know, it was probably a reach for her to even fall for a Chinese man. I'm not sure how far she would have gone same sex. Yeah. Different book.
I'm interested in Miriam as well. We've talked a lot about Ying and Lai Yue. Miriam, I'm interested in her past as well. You know, in this sense, there's a lot of the book's domestic detail is furnished through her eyes. You know, a lot of the cooking and the food. I loved all that detail around food and how to construct a meal and what people cooked and what they ate. There was this sense of the Chinese characters being very competent cooks, and the white people not quite knowing how to cook or prepare the food that was available to them, and Miriam also forgetting her mother's recipes. You know, she couldn't remember the recipe for pie. Just not, you know, what was.
That's interesting. I've never thought about that. I guess really character-wise, I don't think I certainly wasn't trying to say anything about the different foods. I guess I was a bit with the cat and the bush food, you know, that probably I was trying to say something, because when you do read about them in the bush, you know, like I was saying about Mulligan and the Warden Hill, that they did eat whatever they could catch, you know, and this is at the same time as making fun of Chinese for eating everything. So I was trying to say something there, I guess, but Jimmy, I think probably just character-wise, Jimmy was older and probably well versed in cooking for himself with a bit of, you know, soy sauce, whereas Miriam, you know, she's a young, so it was always just a bit of a struggle getting to make what you can with a bit of stringy meat or, you know, some flour, you know. So I think I wasn't actually trying to say anything. I think it was just their characters and how they were responding.
Melody has picked up on that, a question from her. She says, I love the way that Jimmy's shop was such a treasure trove of exotic foods and medicinal herbs. She says, I thought it was interesting how the berries were used by Ying to cure Miriam's eyesight. Out of curiosity, are those real berries? Were they salty plums as well?
Well, there were salty plums. That's when she tricks Miriam.
Oh, into eating the
Salty
salty
plum.
plum. Yeah,
Yes,
yeah.
because because I remember doing that to a girlfriend actually.
Yeah, I did it to my grandma. It was, yeah.
I love it. No, so the berries are goji berries because my grandma used to have terrible macular degeneration, and my dad used to give her goji berries, which she took religiously, and he still, I mean, he grows them now, but he still takes. And actually, I have goji berries in my muesli. So they're actually, you know, those little tiny red dry berries you can get at Woolies now. But
Yeah,
that's
they're a superfood now, right?
That's right. But they're supposed to be good for your eyesight.
Salty plums will never be a superfood, I don't think.
Nope.
Just going back, Wendy says, I like the way that injuries create tension because of the lack of medicine and doctors from a cut being severely bashed up. How did you go with the medical?
Well, I have to admit, you know, Ying's infection, it's like it's like in that movie Castaway with Tom Hanks. In fact, most probably that sort of infection would just kill you in those days, you know, especially out there with no help. But she does get through it. I guess that was to, you know, as the writer, it was to get them from the dig to Maytown to meet Miriam, and to show just how hard it was there. I mean, they all had, I mean, that's something we probably don't realize now that I probably picked up writing my other fiction too, is people just died of the most, you know, little things nowadays, like just little things, you know, but just died or maimed or, you know, had all sorts of diseases and things that are obviously curable help now, but not then. So I just wanted to show that as well, just how tough it was.
And on that as well, Jenny asks, Mirandy, I'm interested in how you came to give Miriam the visual impairment. Was that common at the time?
I don't know about common. I guess there were two things. Like I said, my grandma had macular degeneration, and young people do have it. And I just know how debilitating it can be, you know, like it just really can slow you down, I guess. Just looking at grandma. But also, I guess I just wanted, I didn't want it to be a thing, but also I think a lot of people do have little things, you know, that they live with. So
and injuries and
so it was just something early on I thought Miriam could be living with.
Just a question then, to step back from the content of the book a little bit and to talk about the process again. So what was the process for you in terms of you know, you talked about the note-taking phase, the research phase, writing that first draft. What happens for you between when you hand your first draft to your publisher and when it gets published? What
happens?
What's the feedback loop there, and how much rewriting do you have to do?
Oh, well, with this one I did add a bit more. So I was resistant because, you know, once you finish a book, you just don't want to visit again. And you always get line edits and things, obviously. But this one I actually had to add a bit to the end, you know, for a couple of the characters. And it did make it a better novel, I have no doubt. That was the feedback that I got. So very obediently I did it. But mostly, so that's what happens. And I mean, it takes a long time between handing in your draft and getting that finished product. I mean, there's lots of going back and forth. You know, and then you get pictures of the cover, you know, like maybe, you know, to choices from covers and everything. It's all very exciting.
And yeah.
It's a great period actually, because you're sort of making your book more ship shape, and it's obviously not as hard work as actually doing the first draft. Yeah, you're like finessing it.
It's not heartbreaking. It's not.
Oh no. If anything, like the editors and everybody are just making it better. I mean, it's not heartbreaking.
I have to go back a little bit here because I have missed a couple of comments and questions, so we'll go back and fill in. Where are we? Earlier on, and again, Fiona said, on a visit to Ballarat, the guide explained to us that the Chinese diggers were often more successful because they worked together until a law was passed to prevent them from doing so. Are you aware of
working together? In what way were they not allowed to work together?
Not allowed to gather, like they had to operate as sole traders, perhaps, to stop them from congregating or unionising, or?
I haven't read anything about that. If I know in Victoria, eventually the government had to set up a system of protection because of they were you know, had racist attacks against them so much. That was in the 1860s, I think. By 1877, no, they definitely worked in tongs, like in groups, you know, with their clans. And in fact, they were more successful. So I think in Queensland by the 1877, so the Victorian ones were mostly in the 1860s, I think. By 1877 in Queensland, they weren't allowed to be the first on the ground. They had to, the white Australians had to be finished first before the Chinese could go on that ground. And I think it was even like a year or two later, they had to wait a while. And then apparently it was very frustrating for the white Australians because they would still find a lot of gold because they were just more hands-on at getting it, and they did different. So apparently the Australians used square sharps, the Chinese used round ones, so because the corners were bad luck. Yeah, I haven't heard about, I don't know how you would work alone. Yeah, usually they would work in a clan. I mean, even all their money that they would, it was like a type of human trafficking actually. A lot of them would have to, they would borrow the money and have to pay back for their voyage here and for their license and everything, just like people do nowadays, you know, when they go off to work in Dubai or something. So I don't know how they would work alone.
Which we saw depicted in the book. I'm just going to apologise to people at home in advance. We're not going to get to everyone's questions. We've only got another few minutes before we have to begin to thinking about next month and do a little bit of voting business. But I will try and get to as many as I can. Just a comment, Mirandi from Catherine, who says the novel is beautiful in depicting scenery and a sense of the moment. Thank you for this reading.
Oh, thank you.
Sandra says, I currently reside in a country where superstition often appears to play a significant role in daily life. It felt to me that superstition played a role in les years evolving mental illness. Was that your intention? I know you have chatted a little bit about that.
Well, I don't know if it was my intention as such to sort of to bang on about superstition as such. I was on a book club with my mum was there, and she's from Irish English background. She sort of piped up at one stage saying, you know, even about my dad. My dad's a GP. I mean, he's a very modern man, but that they do, the Chinese, well, according to her, you know, or you know, they do believe in ghosts or whatever. And I would agree, just going by the Chinese I know in my family. So I guess I was just that was just sort of how I wrote it. I wasn't trying to sort of bang on about like different superstitions or anything. And like I said, that ghost bride thing is something that people still believe. So I felt quite comfortable in writing a character 150 years ago believing it, you know.
Callie asks, could you tell us the historical significance of the queue? There was mention of one of the characters being killed if he went back to China without. Yeah.
Okay, so the so where the emperor at the time of China, all the men had to have a queue, and if they didn't have a queue, so the queue showed that you were a subject of the emperor and that you were a willing subject of the emperor. And if you cut it off, then you were a dissenter and you could be executed for it. And I think there were, at the time in China, that's the other reason a lot of people went on these gold rush to America or Australia, is because there were quite a few little wars in China at the time. And I think there were bands of men who'd cut off their queues to fight against, the emperor's reign, I guess. So, and I got that story, I think I thought of it because, also because I met a fellow, and his great-grandfather in Shanghai, his great-grandfather was one of the guys who owned a shop in Maytown. And he, in defiance of another shopkeeper who he was having a fight with, he cut off his queue. And apparently it was quite horrifying and he literally couldn't go back to China for years until they were back. Oh no, I think actually the emperor had been thrown over, say 20 years later, and that's when he went back, because you could be executed for it.
Wow.
Mind you, sometimes the Australian people, in these racist attacks did cut off their queues. So
yeah.
I don't know how they cope with that.
Yeah. We might have time for one more question, I think, before we have to move on to other things. We might be able to squeeze into, but we'll just see. Catherine asks, maybe a quick question for you. As Ying travelled home to China, she was already missing the freedom she had in Australia, presumably as a male. If you, Mirandy, were Ying at the time, where would you prefer to live? China sounded very poor and not necessarily a great place at the time.
That's really interesting, but her mum's in China, and maybe her siblings. Yeah, I don't know with Ying. Part of me thinks if she's anything like who I think she's like, maybe she does get off at Singapore and she does try her hand at adventuring on. But then on the other hand, I think what happens in life, especially when you're young, is, or maybe getting older, is maybe she did go home, and what happens is you just do get back into, your old roles, and the past is a memory. So with Ying, I'm really 50-50. I don't know what she does. I don't know.
Even Cooktown seemed like a kind of a fun option compared to me.
Yeah.
Except for the need to disguise herself.
Except that, then she'd miss her mum. So but some young people are quite, can be quite good at being away from mum. So I don't know.
Roz, quick, simple question. Roz asks, how did you arrive at the title?
The title, okay. So originally it was going to be Gold Mountain Woman, because Gold Mountain Men is what the Chinese called the men who went to either California or Australia. So it was going to be called Gold Mountain Woman because it was going to be about Ying. The book was going to be about Ying and Nerium, but then Lai Ye crept in. So what happened is I looked around, and Stone Sky, so there's a legend about this female, a goddess, and the sky is falling on humans, and she patches it up with 5 different types of jade, I think. So it's for fire, water, wood, metal, and maybe stone. It must be stone. Anyway, 5 things that are all in my novel. So that's where I got Stone Sky from. So Stone Sky with these 5 things that are all in Maytown.
Excellent. I'm going to move us on to the poll, but I reckon we might, while people are voting, we might be able to ask another question as well.
Sure.
I'll just have to do a little bit of So you will now see the titles there, people at home, that you get to vote on for next week. And let me just give you a little précis of each of those books, just in case you're not familiar with them. UQP have provided us with these again, and these are some of their best-selling novels over the years. The Comfort of Figs by Simon Cleary. 1939, in Brisbane, a bridge is built and a country town becomes a city. three young men forge a close relationship as they labour precariously high above the river. But one slip transforms their lives. The second title is Pig City by Andrew Stafford. From cult heroes, the Saints and the Go-Betweens, two national icons such as Powderfinger and Savage Garden, Brisbane has produced more than its share of great bands. But behind the city, behind the music, lay a ghost city of malice and corruption. Followed The Rabbit-Proof Fence by Doris Garamara Pilkington. We know this one from the movie. It's an extraordinary story of courage and faith. It's based on the actual experiences of three girls who fled from the repressive life of Moore River native settlement, following the rabbit-proof fence back to their homelands. And Little Fish Are Sweet by Matthew Condon. It's his extraordinary personal account of writing his Three Crooked Kings trilogy about Zhou-era corruption. So we've got two Zhou-era themed books there. When Condon first interviewed disgraced former police commissioner Terry Lewis, he had no idea that it would be the start of a turbulent 6-year journey, and decades of crime and corruption were revealed in a new light. Okay, so feel free to vote away. Look, we can see how your tastes are changing from moment to moment as you think about those titles. And while that's happening, Mirandi, I shall ask you another question from Gillian. She says the book squarely addresses and highlights racism. Can you say something about your choices in making your Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander characters almost invisible, given that this is a National Reconciliation Week? That might be something to ponder. So,
that's really interesting. So I'd say, so when I first was going to write this novel, like I said, it was going to be a Eurasian novel. And then when I read more about North Queensland, obviously it became obvious I had to address things to do with how the local Aboriginal people were treated. And I consulted with the Western Yulanji people, with the CEO, and asked about, so what you read a lot about it, how scared the Chinese were of the Aboriginal people up there. And you read about the terrible, massacres. But what you're reading about the massacres is not like we read now. It was more accounts, almost gleeful accounts, from the time of, what they were doing to the local Indigenous people. So I asked him if I could write about how scared the Chinese were and about the violence, and he said I should. But also that's, but then I had to sort of think about, that it's not my story to tell either. Like, I didn't want to appropriate any voices. So all I could do was show what my Chinese characters might have seen. Like, I couldn't write, and I know there's an Aboriginal writer in Queensland at the moment writing about it. I mean, it's not my story. So all I could do was write what they might have seen on the goldfields like Lai Yue. So what I did is what I did with a few things in the book is I took white digger accounts from the time, like what Clem says at the beginning when they come across the massacre. And I took these white accounts and skewed them so they were from the Chinese point of view. So my Chinese characters are seeing what's happening, because like I said, I can't write from the Aboriginal point of view. And then what I wanted to do also towards the end, like with what Lai Yue does, is I wanted to show that it wasn't, that the Chinese were also complicit in what happened to the Aboriginal people there and the landscape and what happened to their landscape, So, and I'd say in writing this novel, I probably gave most consideration to how I was going to write about that terrible past, keeping in mind it's not my story, but also it's part of my story, and it had to be there.
So those cultural permissions come into play there in the right.
That's right.
Yeah. There is a follow-up question from Jackie as well. In your research, did you come across tension between the Aboriginal people and the Chinese? I think you've just touched on that actually, Mirandi. And the scene where the Aboriginal man is beaten is quite horrific. but in other parts of the book, the Aborigines are depicted as having particular knowledge of the Bêche de Mer, for example. So I think
They had knowledge of what? Sorry.
Of the Bêche de Mer,
Oh yeah, well that's from more north because
yeah,
for many years before that, they were trading. They were trading in the sea cucumber with the Indonesians and the Chinese. And also you've got to remember that they were all from different areas. They were different, you know, like the troopers. So, you know, in the book, there's the troopers. They were probably from the south. You know, there was the little boy who the blacksmith had. He probably came from another area with the blacksmith. There was that man who came from north, so he was with the postman. And then there were the local, you know, Indigenous who were the Western Yalanji people. I mean, I guess, yeah, they were like a lot of my Chinese characters. They were from different areas and clans that didn't even have the same language. So I guess that's what I was trying to show. And I did consult with an Aboriginal writer, and that's why you will see them in the story, you know, different aspects, I guess, not just the Indigenous being massacred.
I've got a vague memory, like I shouldn't quote it if I can't remember the exact details from my own kind of research many years ago, but I've got this vague recollection of William Young talking about, you know, you know, Indigenous and Chinese violence, you know, in the family business that needed to be settled there as well. So I think, you know,
well, certainly at the time,
the violence can sometimes flow all ways.
The Chinese were very terrified, and some of them were killed. But I do wonder how much maybe some of the stories were exaggerated to scare, you know, by white Australians to scare the Chinese off even more. You know, like, I mean, we can never know. But mostly, I just wanted to show everyone there was complicit in displacing in the violence against the Yalanji people.
Yeah. Thank you, Mary. Thank you, Mirandi. So I'm looking at too many boxes on my screen. Our vote has closed. More than 90% of you voted, which was great. And there was a late run for the comfort of FIGS, but our winner by a clear margin is Follow the Rabbit Proof Fence by Doris Garamara Pilkington. So that will be our next book in UQ Book Club, which will be on Thursday, June the 25th, and we will contact you and we'll circulate those details, and we will get an exciting person to come in and chat with us about that text. So Mirandi, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for sharing your book. It was such a great book to begin the book club with. It was so great to have you here and to be supporting you know, a promotion of a book during lockdown as well. So
yes, thank you. And thanks to everyone for coming. Thank you for reading my book. Thank you.
I just have a couple of extra thank yous as well. So Emily Sievers and Mary Brown, who've been helping us behind the scenes today. Olivia Brown, our school's communication and events coordinator. Thank you to Weston Bruner, who is the Director of Advancement here at UQ, for getting this whole ball rolling. And our Executive Dean, Heather Zwicker, for providing it with such great support as well. And also thank you to Louise Corniget from the University of Queensland Press for providing us with the titles and providing you guys with discounts to the book as well, which will happen next time. So thank you, everyone. We're going to post a recording of the interview and the discussion with Mirandi on the website for the Centre for Critical and Creative Writing. So Google us to come and find that if you would like it, or if you want to recommend it to a friend, or a reading club of your own, a book club of your own. And of course, if you want to come and study writing or literature or drama or journalism with us here at the University of Queensland, get in touch anytime. In the meantime, keep reading and stay safe. And thank you, everyone. Looking forward to seeing you in June.
Thank you.
Thanks, Mirandi.